You know, I've been to more than 50 countries in my life. I've seen billion-dollar skylines, massive economies, and endless promises. But there's one thing that always surprises me when I talk to global investors, startup founders, or even governments. They keep saying the same thing. We want to build another Singapore. And every time I hear that, I smile because I know they have no idea what that really means. Most people look at Singapore and see the clean streets, the airport, the discipline. They think that's the secret. But what they don't see, what even many Singaporeans forget, is the invisible design behind it all. It's not luck. It's not magic. It's a blueprint built on mindset, discipline, and long-term thinking that most of the world still refuses to understand. I want to tell you something very simple tonight. The reason the world is copying Singapore is not because of its GDP. It's because Singapore never waits for miracles. It manufactures them. And that's a rare quality in our time. When I first visited Singapore in the early 2000s, I remember looking out from the Marina Bay area and thinking, how can a country so small think so big? In China, we had land, factories, and manpower. In Malaysia, you had resources, culture, and potential. But Singapore had only one thing: clarity. Clarity of purpose. Clarity of direction. Clarity of leadership. That's the first secret of the blueprint. Clarity creates speed. When everyone understands why they are building something, they stop wasting time arguing about what to build. You see, too many nations today are like big companies without vision. They have meetings, committees, and slogans. But no alignment, no trust. One year they want to be global, next year they protect local. One government builds, the next one breaks. That's not strategy, that's noise. Singapore's founders understood this. They said, we are small. That's our strength. When you are small, you can't afford confusion. You can't afford waste. That's how they turned limitation into laser focus. And that, my friends, is lesson number one from Singapore's secret blueprint. If you can't be the biggest, be the most consistent. Let me tell you a truth from business. When Alibaba was small, we were competing against giants like eBay, Amazon, and Tencent. They had money. We had belief. We survived because we had one thing they didn't: a clear reason to exist. That's exactly how Singapore built itself. Every person I meet here, from a taxi driver to a startup founder, seems to understand the same national mission: work hard, stay reliable, earn trust. Do you realize how rare that is in the world today? Most countries can't even agree on what they stand for anymore. But Singapore, even when people disagree, they don't lose discipline. That's a level of maturity even large nations envy. So the first thing the world is copying is not technology, not infrastructure. It's the culture of clarity. People often tell me, Jack, Singapore is lucky. I tell them, no, Singapore is intentional. Luck builds casinos, not countries. Discipline builds destiny. Let's be honest. The Singapore model is not glamorous. It's not a movie story. It's the story of people waking up early, following rules, paying taxes, and trusting that order will eventually reward them. It's boring, right? But that's why it works. Because real success is often boring before it becomes inspiring. The world sees Singapore's skyline, but they don't see the years of planning behind every building. They see Changi Airport, but they don't see how it reflects a national obsession with efficiency. They see safety, but not the sleepless nights of policymakers ensuring systems never collapse. In other words, they admire the fruit, but they ignore the roots. And without roots, nothing grows for long. That's the second part of the secret. Discipline before reward. When you travel across Asia, you realize something painful. Many countries want results faster than they deserve them. They want world-class reputation without world-class responsibility. Everyone wants success. No one wants structure. That's why the Singapore story is hard to copy, because discipline cannot be imported. It has to be grown. You can copy the buildings, the ports, even the education system. But if the people don't believe in long-term sacrifice, it won't work. It's like trying to plant a tree in dry soil. It looks fine on day 1, but dies on day 10. Singapore's leaders understood something that every entrepreneur must learn. You can't build greatness if you change your direction every election. Most countries chase applause. Singapore chased alignment. That's why today, while many nations are arguing over past mistakes, Singapore is planning 50 years ahead. And that, my friends, is the real difference between politics and vision. Politics is about popularity. Vision is about permanence. Sometimes I ask myself, why do so many foreigners fall in love with Singapore after just one visit? It's because when they come here, they feel safe. Safe to walk. Safe to invest. Safe to dream. That feeling is not built by chance. It's engineered through trust. And trust is the rarest currency in the 21st century. Let me share a small story. A few years ago, I met a European investor who told me, Jack, I don't invest in countries. I invest in predictability. He said, Singapore gives me peace of mind, even if returns are smaller. That's when I realized, in this noisy, unstable world, predictability is a premium product. And Singapore sells that better than anyone else. Look at how companies operate. A brand like Apple succeeds because customers know exactly what to expect. Every new iPhone looks similar. That's not laziness. That's consistency. And that consistency builds confidence. Singapore operates the same way. Policies may evolve, but principles don't. You always know what you're getting. Efficiency, safety, logic. Now imagine if individuals lived like that. If every young person treated their career like Singapore treats its economy, with patience, focus, and zero excuses. Do you know what would happen? They would become unstoppable. Because clarity and consistency are not just national values. They are personal weapons. They separate people who talk about success from those who actually build it. Sometimes I hear people complain, Singapore is too strict. Too many rules. I smile and say, that's exactly why it works. Rules are not chains. They are frameworks. You can't build freedom on chaos. Even creativity needs discipline. When I started my first company, everyone told me I was crazy. Jack, the internet is risky. Why not play safe? I said, I'd rather build a new system than live in an old comfort zone. That's what Singapore did. While others were complaining about colonial history, Singapore was writing its own future. While others were debating identity, Singapore was defining excellence. They didn't copy anyone's comfort. They built their own standards. And now the whole world is copying them. Let's be honest. Singapore is not perfect. No country is. But what makes it admirable is how it deals with imperfection. When something goes wrong, they fix it. They don't hide. They don't blame. They improve. That culture of self-correction is what every company, every leader, every citizen should learn. In China, when we face problems, we often say, let's wait for a policy. In Malaysia, people say, maybe next year it will be better. In Singapore, they say, let's solve it today. That difference in response defines destiny. So the first pillar of the Singapore blueprint is not economy, not technology, it's responsibility. I once asked a young Singaporean entrepreneur, what drives you? He said, Jack, I just don't want to let my country down. That answer touched me deeply. Because when individuals carry that sense of duty, nations rise naturally. When you make national pride personal, you build something the world can't buy. That's how Singapore turned collective purpose into personal motivation. Every citizen became a shareholder of the country's reputation. That's the invisible system no one can replicate through policy. It's cultural capital. And it's priceless. But here's the interesting question. Can this blueprint survive the future? Because the world is changing faster than ever. AI, automation shifting economies, everything is moving. And the danger of success is always complacency. The same discipline that built Singapore must now evolve into innovation, because clarity built yesterday's Singapore. Creativity must build tomorrow's. But before we talk about the future, we must first understand the foundation. And that foundation, my friends, is what the world is secretly copying every single day. Not skyscrapers, not laws, but the mindset of managed ambition, the ability to dream big, but execute small, to think global, but act local, to move fast, but stay precise. That's the Singapore equation. And the world is still trying to solve it. So tonight, when I speak of Singapore's secret blueprint, I'm not just talking about a country. I'm talking about a philosophy. One that any person, any business, any nation can adopt. Because the principles are universal: clarity before speed, discipline before reward, responsibility before pride. These are not policies. These are truths. And whoever lives by them wins. You know, sometimes people think leadership is about position, about power, about having a title. But I've learned that real leadership is about responsibility, not authority. When I look at Singapore, I see a nation that treats leadership like a craft, not a career. From the very beginning, this country didn't just choose leaders who could win elections. It chose people who could win the future. That's a very big difference. The world is full of politicians, but very few nations invest in problem solvers. Singapore did. When you talk to Singapore's older generation, they will tell you stories about how the government used to walk the ground, not just talk in air-conditioned rooms. That was leadership by example. And in business, it's the same thing. I always tell my team at Alibaba, don't lead from your mouth, lead from your behavior. Because people copy what you do, not what you say. Singapore's entire success is built on that simple principle. The leaders didn't ask the people to be disciplined. They lived discipline. They didn't demand accountability. They demonstrated it. That's why today, when the world says, we want to be like Singapore, I often think, are you willing to walk the same path of pain, patience, and precision? Because you can't copy the results without copying the responsibility. Singapore's blueprint is not just about what they built, but about how they built it. They didn't chase perfection. They chased improvement. Every small improvement done consistently became a masterpiece. That's what most countries forget. Progress is not about big leaps. It's about small, relentless steps in the right direction. When I look at Malaysia or even China, I see countries full of talent, full of dreams. But sometimes what's missing is alignment. Too many people want to be the hero. Too few want to build the system. Singapore understood that the system is the real hero. That's the second layer of its blueprint, system over ego. If the system works, the people rise together. If the system fails, even the smartest individuals sink with it. In companies, in governments, in families, it's the same law. I often say this: if you want to know whether a nation will grow or collapse, don't look at its skyline. Look at how it handles feedback. A weak country hides from feedback. A strong country fixes it. Singapore built a culture where feedback is not an insult. It's fuel. Every 5 or 10 years, they review, they question, they improve. It's like an entrepreneur looking at his own mistakes, not to feel shame, but to find direction. That's why Singapore keeps evolving when others stagnate. The blueprint is alive because the people inside it are not afraid to change. I still remember talking to a group of Singapore students at NUS many years ago. They asked me, Jack, how do we stay competitive when the world is getting faster? And I said, you already have the answer. You think long term. Singapore teaches patience in a world that celebrates shortcuts. It's the same in business. Everyone wants the next big thing, but the real winners are the ones who can stay focused when the crowd moves on. Singapore didn't grow by chasing trends. It grew by building trust, and trust takes time. When you run a business, you must choose, do you want to look good today or last for 50 years? Singapore chose the second. Every project, every policy, every strategy was designed to outlive the people who made it. That's vision. That's leadership. That's the part of the blueprint the world doesn't see. The ability to plan so far ahead that your success becomes inevitable, not accidental. And you can apply this even in your personal life. Don't live for likes, live for legacy. Don't build for speed, build for stability. Now let's talk about the part of the blueprint that fascinates me the most, the economic alchemy. How Singapore turned scarcity into strategy. Think about it. A small island, no oil, no agriculture, no natural resources. If it were most countries, they would complain. But Singapore said, we will use what we have, our brains, our discipline, our trust. And that became gold. When a country learns to monetize reliability, it becomes invincible. That's how Singapore turned its weaknesses into the world's strength. Today, every global company wants to have an office here, not because it's cheap, but because it's safe. Not safe from crime, safe from unpredictability. The laws are clear, the systems work, the corruption is low, the culture is disciplined. These things may sound boring, but they are priceless in business. Investors would rather earn less in Singapore than risk more somewhere else. Because they know one simple truth, predictability is profit. That's the secret Singapore discovered early. The world often confuses luxury with value. Singapore built value without luxury. That's another genius move. They didn't try to impress people. They tried to earn trust. When a country focuses on reputation, not just revenue, everything changes. This is something every entrepreneur should remember. When people trust your name, they don't compare your price. That's why I say trust is the new oil, and Singapore drilled the first well. But don't think it was easy. The first decades were painful. People worked long hours, made sacrifices, lived with strict rules. Yet they believed that pain was investment. And they were right. That's the long-term mindset missing in many developing nations today. Everyone wants to be like Singapore, but no one wants to go through the same struggles Singapore went through. Without struggle, there's no standard. Let's talk about the human side now, the mindset. Singapore's secret is not just its government, it's its people. The ordinary citizens who follow rules, respect order, and trust that effort leads to results. In many countries, people complain about the system. In Singapore, people cooperate with the system. That's a huge difference. When citizens and government move in the same direction, magic happens. When they fight each other, progress dies. The education system here is another invisible pillar. It doesn't just teach knowledge, it teaches attitude. From young, children are told to aim high but stay humble, to be competitive but fair, to be global but still grounded. That's the balance that built Singapore's workforce. Globally competent, locally committed. You can't copy that overnight. It's the product of decades of cultural engineering. Parents, teachers, leaders, all working together to raise a generation that doesn't just want to win, but wants to deserve winning. I once met a Singaporean family running a small hawker stall. The father told me, Jack, we're not rich, but we're proud. We work clean, we pay fair, we sleep well. That one line stayed in my mind for years. Because that's the spirit that built this country. Pride without arrogance. Progress without shortcuts. The rest of the world sees numbers. I see values. That's the real foundation of the Singapore miracle. And yet, what's most amazing is how Singapore never lets success become an excuse. Every time the world praises it, the country quietly prepares for the next challenge. They know the moment you start feeling safe, you start falling behind. That humility, that constant hunger to improve, is another part of the blueprint. In life, you should always stay a little dissatisfied. Not unhappy, but hungry. Singapore built a culture of constructive dissatisfaction. And that's why it never stops evolving. Now, many people ask me, Jack, can this model be applied elsewhere? My answer is yes, but only if the people are ready to change themselves first. The secret of Singapore is not in its geography, it's in its psychology. If your mindset changes, your country changes. If your attitude changes, your future changes. This is not just national advice, it's personal advice, because everyone can build their own Singapore in your career, in your business, in your family. Discipline, clarity, and responsibility can make even the smallest life extraordinary. The world today is full of noise, social media noise, political noise, financial noise. Everyone talks, few listen. Everyone blames, few build. Singapore chose silence and strategy. It let its results speak louder than words. That's what I want you to remember. Don't shout about success, build it quietly. Let your work make the noise. That's how respect is earned. And now, the world is copying this. Dubai studied Singapore to design its systems. Rwanda studied Singapore for its city planning. Vietnam for its education model. Even parts of China borrowed Singapore's housing and management structure. But the truth is, they can only copy the design, not the discipline. Because blueprints are easy to draw, hard to live by. That's why, even after 50 years, Singapore still stands as a reference point. It's a living example of what happens when a nation follows one consistent vision for generations. So I tell my friends in Malaysia, in Indonesia, in India, don't just look at Singapore's surface. Look at its soul. The real secret is invisible clarity of purpose, consistency of values, and courage to do what's right, not what's popular. That's the formula. It worked for a small island. It can work for anyone who has the discipline to follow it. Because in the end, success is not about size, not about luck, not about history. It's about intention. Singapore intended to win, not by force, but by focus. And that's something every individual and every country can learn from. You may not have resources, but if you have resolve, you already have everything you need. When you reach a certain level of success, the biggest danger isn't failure, it's comfort. Comfort makes you forget hunger. Comfort makes you believe your system can run on autopilot. That's the next challenge Singapore faces. The world has changed. What used to take 50 years now changes in 5. Technology moves faster than policy. Generations think differently, and stability, which was once the biggest strength, can slowly become a weakness if it stops adapting. So here's my reality check. The same discipline that built Singapore must now transform into creativity. The same order that created progress must now make room for boldness. You see, efficiency got Singapore here. Innovation will take it further. The first generation built the foundation. The second generation optimized it. But the third must reinvent it, or the story will start to repeat itself. Because every great system eventually faces its own success as the enemy. Look at what happened to many global companies. Nokia, Kodak, even Yahoo. They weren't destroyed by competitors. They were destroyed by their comfort. They forgot how to question themselves. They forgot how to take risks. And that's a lesson for every country, every company, every person. If you want to stay relevant, you must never stop learning. You must treat success as a temporary guest, not a permanent address. When I speak to young Singaporeans, I can feel both pride and pressure. Pride because they inherit a system that works. Pressure because it's hard to imagine something better than what already exists. But I tell them, don't just maintain your parents' Singapore. Create your own. The Singapore of the future will not be built by imitation, but by imagination. It's not about copying what worked yesterday. It's about daring to redesign what will work tomorrow. And here's where Malaysia enters the story again. The truth is, Malaysia and Singapore are not rivals. They are reflections of each other. Two countries sharing history, roots, and destiny. One became a blueprint. The other holds the resources to write the next chapter. I believe the future of Southeast Asia depends on how these two countries learn from each other. Malaysia can learn focus from Singapore. Singapore can learn heart from Malaysia. One has the system, the other has the soul. Together, they can balance logic with humanity, structure with spirit. I've always said, a good neighbor is better than a distant friend. If Malaysia rises, Singapore benefits. If Singapore innovates, Malaysia gains. This region's success doesn't depend on competition. It depends on collaboration. The world is moving toward regional power blocks. Asia must think as one. We can't afford the ego of smallness anymore. The next 20 years will belong to nations that cooperate, not isolate. And the Singapore-Malaysia story could be the perfect model of that. Now, many people ask me, Jack, what is the biggest lesson from Singapore's blueprint? My answer is simple. It's not about how to become rich. It's about how to stay respected. You see, wealth attracts attention, but respect attracts imitation. That's why the world copies Singapore, not because it's rich, but because it's respected. Respect is built through integrity, reliability, and long-term thinking. And those are qualities the modern world is losing fast. Today, the global economy is uncertain. AI is replacing jobs. Inflation is rising. Politics is divisive. People are scared. But when I look at Singapore, I feel calm. Because I know it has something most countries don't: resilience. That's the hidden power behind the blueprint. Resilience built through discipline, patience, and community trust. You can destroy buildings, but you can't destroy belief. And belief is what built this nation. But belief alone is not enough for the next era. The future belongs to those who can combine belief with creativity. Singapore's next mission is to prove that a system can stay disciplined and innovative. To show that rules can exist with imagination. To teach the world that small countries can lead big conversations about AI, ethics, sustainability, and humanity. Because the next global revolution won't be industrial. It will be moral. It will test not just how fast you grow, but how fairly you grow. If Singapore wants to stay a model, it must not only lead in GDP, it must lead in goodness. The world doesn't just need rich examples, it needs right examples. And I believe Singapore has the foundation to be that light. Not by being perfect, but by being honest. Honest about its limits, honest about its future, honest about its purpose. That honesty is what made it great, and that honesty will keep it great. When I think about the story of Singapore, I always feel emotional, because it's not just the story of a country. It's the story of human possibility. It's proof that you don't need to be born powerful to become powerful. You don't need to be big to make a global impact. You just need clarity, courage, and consistency. That's the same advice I give to every entrepreneur, every dreamer, every young person in Asia. Don't wait for a big stage. Build your own small one and perform with excellence. The world will notice. Let me tell you something personal. In my early days, I faced hundreds of rejections. People said, Jack, you're from a small city in China, no background, no English, no money. How can you compete? I smiled and said, if Singapore can do it, so can I. And that's the truth. This country inspired me long before I ever succeeded. It showed me that limitations are just starting points for innovation. That's why I feel grateful. Not just as an entrepreneur, but as a human being for what Singapore represents. Sometimes I imagine the founders of Singapore sitting together decades ago, planning something that seemed impossible. They didn't have data. They didn't have resources. They only had belief. And that belief changed everything. That's what leadership is. The courage to dream logically. The ability to see the invisible and make it visible. The capacity to say, we may not have much, but we will make it matter. That same courage is what every nation, every company, every individual needs today. And yes, even Malaysia can find its own blueprint, not by copying Singapore, but by rediscovering its own strengths. Malaysia's diversity is an advantage, not a weakness. Its youth, creativity, and resourcefulness can build something equally inspiring if guided by discipline and purpose. Singapore's story should not make Malaysians feel inferior. It should make them feel challenged, because the rise of one small country proved that greatness is possible anywhere. You see, we are entering an era where power is no longer about military or territory. It's about credibility and creativity. Singapore built credibility. The next generation must build creativity. And the two together can redefine Asia's global influence. I often tell leaders, don't just build countries that others visit, build models that others respect. Singapore did that. Now it's time for the rest of us to follow not its path, but its principles. If you take one message from me tonight, let it be this: the secret blueprint of Singapore is not owned by Singapore. It belongs to anyone who dares to think long-term, act consistently, and serve selflessly. You can use it in your business, your family, your community. Because this blueprint is not about money. It's about mindset. It's not about winning. It's about deserving to win. And if the world truly wants to copy Singapore, then it must also copy its humility, because humility is the ultimate protection against decline. The moment you think you've figured it all out, you stop listening. The moment you stop listening, you stop learning. And the moment you stop learning, you fall. Singapore taught us that greatness is not a destination, it's a discipline. Every day, you rebuild it. So as I end tonight, I want to speak directly to the people of Singapore and Malaysia, two nations I admire deeply. You've both shown the world that Asia is not a follower, but a leader. You've proven that culture, integrity, and focus can build miracles. And now the world is watching again to see what your next chapter will be. Will you rest or will you reinvent? Will you protect what you've built or prepare for what's coming? My hope, my belief is that you'll choose the second, that you'll keep daring, keep building, keep teaching the world that small countries can have big hearts and that clear minds can change history. Because in the end, the real secret of Singapore's blueprint is not about buildings or systems. It's about people who refuse to give up even when the odds said they should. That's the same energy that built Alibaba, that built modern China, that built this part of Asia into one of the most inspiring stories on earth. So remember this: success is never a miracle. It's a choice repeated every single day. Choose clarity over chaos. Choose consistency over convenience. Choose vision over victory. And when you do, you won't just build your own Singapore. You'll build a life the world wants to copy. Thank you for listening. And thank you, Singapore and Malaysia, for reminding us all what's possible when people believe in discipline, in unity, and in the power of small beginnings. My friends, when people ask me, Jack, which country do you think is ahead of the rest of the world? Most expect me to say America, or maybe China, maybe even India today. But let me surprise you. It's not always the biggest that lead. Sometimes it's the smallest. And in this case, it's Singapore. I know for some of you, this sounds strange. How can a country so small, with no natural resources, with barely 6 million people, be ahead of giants like America, China, or Europe? But the truth is not about size. The truth is about strategy, foresight, and discipline. And in these areas, Singapore is at least 10 years ahead of the rest of the world. Let me explain. First, think about planning. Most countries plan around elections. 4 years, 5 years, short-term cycles. They ask, what can I give the people today to win votes tomorrow? That's politics. But Singapore is different.